Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. The call came in at 7:07 a.m. Calm voice, no panic. Just 7 words that would haunt responders for months. My husband's on the ground, bleeding. In towns like Broughton, murders don't erupt, they simmer. For decades. Then someone finally tips the pot over. At first glance, it didn't look like murder. The call log showed Christine Rall rang emergency services from a farmhouse just outside the village limits. A narrow, winding lane separated her property from the rest of the rural landscape. It was the kind of place where problems stayed inside and stayed quiet, but the blood didn't. By 7:22 a.m., first responders arrived to find Ian Rall, 72, face down on the gravel path between his barn and the driveway. His arms were limp. There was a visible wound to his upper back, pooling blood beneath him. What caught the attention of the first paramedic wasn't the injury, it was the distance. A clear trail of deep red streaks stretched from the entryway of the stable all the way to where Ian lay, roughly 27 meters of partial drag, smear, and collapsed footfall. Ian wasn't breathing. His face had gone pale. His lips were cyanotic. When the crew turned him slightly to inspect the wound, they immediately called it in as a potential homicide. No sign of CPR, no effort to stop the bleeding. No visible panic from the woman who had called it in. Christine Rall, Ian's wife of nearly 3 decades, stood nearby. She wore an oversized barn coat, her hair pulled back in a low knot. Her hands were clean. When asked what happened, she replied, "He must have tripped. He was mucking out the stables, lost his balance, and landed wrong. Must have hit something sharp." But the injury didn't fit the explanation. Inside the barn, a forensic team found no large blunt objects or sharp edges near where the blood trail began. There were no signs of a slip, no disturbed hay, no broken tools, and tucked just behind the feed bin was a 12-centimeter kitchen knife, lightweight stainless steel stained with blood. It had no fingerprints, no visible signs of dust or disuse. It had been cleaned and concealed, poorly. Officers quickly secured the scene and requested a forensic lead from regional services. Ian's body was moved to the coroner's office for post-mortem. The knife was bagged and labeled for DNA and trace analysis. Meanwhile, Christine stayed at the property, answering baseline questions. Her demeanor remained composed, measured. When asked why she hadn't administered first aid, she responded, "I thought he was already gone. I wasn't sure what to do." But data always tells a cleaner story than memory. Christine's mobile phone history showed an outgoing call at 6:48 a.m., not to 911, but to a local friend known to care for animals. That woman arrived at the property shortly after 7 o'clock a.m., entering through the side gate. She fed the horses, collected the dogs. By 7:06, she was still in the barn when Christine finally made the emergency call. In the words of one responder, she organized care for the animals before she called for help. That's not shock, that's order. The first inconsistency in Christine's version of events didn't come from her words. It came from the timeline. Digital router logs from the home Wi-Fi showed no activity or connectivity disruptions overnight. Christine's phone had remained active, location services enabled. Ian's phone, however, had been powered off at 9:32 p.m. the night before. It was found the next morning, face down, screen locked, on the kitchen counter. No calls placed. No messages sent after 9 o'clock p.m. But one message, time-stamped 8:42 p.m., was sent to Ian's daughter from a previous marriage. 4 words. Don't ever trust her again. No other messages followed. While detectives initiated background checks and prepared for an official interview, forensic technicians worked through the scene. Gravel and dirt beneath Ian's body were sampled. Luminol tests inside the house came back negative. No visible signs of blood in the kitchen, living room, or bedroom. The barn remained the only clear site of origin. The blood trail began near the first hay rack, curved slightly toward the stable door, then ran jagged and broken until it ended beneath Ian's chest. One clean impression of his left boot was found near the barn entrance. He was walking when the injury occurred, or trying to walk. That was key. The stab wound measured 11.4 cm in depth. It had entered below the left scapula at a downward angle, slicing through lung tissue and rupturing a major vessel. The coroner listed cause of death as internal hemorrhage leading to hypovolemic shock. Estimated time of death, 6:55 to 7:05 a.m. There were no defensive wounds, no scrapes, bruises, or lacerations on his arms or hands, no broken fingernails, no signs he had fought back. It was fast, silent, from behind. That single wound was all it took. One motion, 1 minute, then 27 meters of collapse. Back at the house, investigators began cataloging Christine's behavior. She had no visible signs of blood transfer. A faint smudge on her sleeve was not consistent with direct contact. The only indication that she'd touched Ian at all came from her own statement. I bent down to see if he was still breathing. Officers noted that she did not cry. She did not shake. She remained mostly silent unless questioned directly. Later that day, a detective asked if there was any possibility Ian had done this to himself. An accident with a tool, a collapse onto a sharp implement, something that could explain the wound without implying violence. Christine said she wasn't sure. But the barn contained no such implement, no tool with a blade even remotely similar to the recovered knife. There were no other suspects on the property, no vehicle tracks besides theirs, no surveillance footage from nearby roads, no witnesses, no alarms, and no signs of forced entry. Detective Chief Inspector Wallace reviewed the field notes that evening. One line stood out. Wife stated she was unsure how long he'd been down, yet the call was placed exactly 19 minutes after she was seen speaking with her friend in the yard. 19 minutes of feeding horses, securing dogs, wiping down counters, and not once approaching the body until help was already on its way. Wallace wrote in the margin, "The timeline isn't broken. That's the problem." Everything about the scene was too clean, too logical, too under control, but that didn't make it innocent. What made it dangerous was what came next. There's a saying in homicide investigations, when you can't find a break-in, you look for a breakdown. And in the Rawl household, it wasn't just the blood that pointed inward. It was the structure, the way things were always quiet, but never calm. The morning after the crime scene was secured, Devon Cornwall Police assigned a specialized behavioral crimes unit to conduct a forensic timeline audit. The first task was to validate Christine Rawls' movements during the 24 hours leading up to Ian's death. That meant pulling metadata, cell tower logs, location pings, digital transactions, and service call records. What they found wasn't loud, but it was steady. Christine's phone showed a near-exact daily routine for the week preceding Ian's death. She left the house only twice, once for groceries and once to attend an equine therapy session in nearby Ilfracombe. GPS traces showed consistent signal behavior, no anomalies, no dead zones. Her internet browsing history from the day before, however, included articles on thoracic injuries in livestock, blood volume loss estimates, and, a red flag, what causes a single stab to collapse a lung. The search window, 3:18 p.m. to 3:44 p.m., the day before Ian was killed. That detail was passed to the Crown Prosecution Service immediately. Back at the scene, crime scene investigators recovered Christine's gardening gloves from the utility room sink. Lab swabs confirmed trace blood on the right glove, later matched to Ian via DNA. The left glove was clean. The gloves had been partially washed but not laundered. Investigators noted this as a probable attempt to manage residue without triggering suspicion, an effort to control evidence, not destroy it. But forensic sequencing isn't only about DNA, it's about patterns. Christine's weekly order history at the local butcher had changed that month. She ordered pre-packaged cuts instead of whole carcasses. No need for knives. The house knives were all accounted for. All but one. The knife recovered near Ian's body matched a set bought by Christine 3 years prior. But the one found outside had been sharpened recently, more so than the others. An unused honing steel was still drying near the sink. Inside the barn, trace luminol analysis revealed droplets spaced evenly beneath the initial blood pool. They were small, spherical, uniform, suggesting vertical blood drip rather than lateral spray, meaning Ian had likely been stabbed from behind while stationary and remained upright for a few seconds before falling. This wasn't a fall, one of the techs noted flatly. It was a straight drive, one stroke. Investigators returned to prior calls for service. 14 calls over the course of their marriage, none escalated to arrest, all documented as verbal dispute. In 2 cases, Ian alleged poisoning. Christine accused gaslighting in 3, but there was never physical evidence either way. Officers arrived, took statements, left. Until now, they also contacted neighbors and known acquaintances. One woman, a friend of Christine's for over 2 decades, agreed to provide a voluntary statement. She recalled Christine expressing concern about her safety several times in the last year, but never mentioned violence. It was more control, she said. He managed everything. She didn't even have the bank login. But Ian's financial records told a different story. Christine had been listed as co-owner on every account since 2015. She had access to the farm's operating income, 2 vehicles, and all online utilities. She wasn't financially trapped. She wasn't legally isolated. And still, there was no indication she'd ever tried to leave. That contradiction became critical. By day's end, a clearer behavioral profile began to form. Christine was meticulous, measured. She operated within familiar boundaries, but when disrupted, she reset them, quietly. Christine's official interview was scheduled for the next morning, but ahead of that, officers requested a full download of her phone. Her consent was given without objection. The contents included standard apps, contacts, a few personal notes, and calendar entries. One of those entries, dated 1 week before the incident, simply read, "Tuesday, clear the path." That phrase in itself didn't mean much, but investigators would later determine the gravel lane where Ian collapsed had, in fact, been swept clean of debris the day before he died. There were no tire tracks, no feed sacks, no waste bins, only one wheelbarrow parked neatly by the gate. The question wasn't whether Christine planned a killing. It was whether she created a sequence where it could happen without chaos. And sometimes, as DCI Wallace said that evening, that's more dangerous than planning at all. Calculated spontaneity, he called it. She didn't need a motive. She just needed an opportunity where no one could interrupt. At a glance, the injury seemed clean. Too clean. One stab. No hesitation marks. No shallow testing wounds. The kind of wound that doesn't suggest panic or defense, it suggests control. The autopsy report confirmed what the scene already implied. Ian Rawl was stabbed once in the back, just beneath the left shoulder blade, at a downward angle consistent with standing posture. The blade pierced the upper lobe of his left lung and nicked the subclavian artery. Blood filled the thoracic cavity within minutes. He died from internal hemorrhage. What was missing was just as telling. No signs of restraint, no bruising on the wrists or face, no fractured ribs, not a single scratch under the fingernails. According to the forensic pathologist, Dr. Grace Monroe, there were no injuries that could be attributed to defensive action. That tells me either he never saw it coming or he didn't think he had to defend himself. That second possibility lingered. Ian was found wearing a pair of waterproof overalls and a thick stable jacket. Blood had seeped into the lining from the inside out, further confirming the stab occurred while he was upright. The injury location also ruled out a self-inflicted wound. There was no realistic angle from which Ian could have caused it himself. The wound path required a left-handed upward thrust, delivered from behind. Forensic toxicology showed no alcohol, no narcotics, no sedatives. Ian's stomach contents revealed a simple breakfast: oats, apple slices, black coffee. He was sober, alert, standing, and he never saw it coming. Detectives reviewed his phone records again. His final activity was sending a message to his adult daughter at 8:42 p.m. the night before. "Don't ever trust her again." A single line. No reply. Investigators couldn't ignore the implication, but they couldn't treat it as proof either. Context was missing. That message in isolation could have been about anything: money, property, an argument, and context mattered. They turned to Ian's broader digital footprint. His iCloud account was linked to a tablet stored in the house. It hadn't been used in over a week. On it, investigators found several unsent emails, drafts, written but never sent. Some were mundane, shopping lists, appointment notes, but one draft, dated 3 weeks before his death, stood out. "If something happens to me, make sure the farm goes to Emily. I don't want her touching a thing." The email wasn't addressed, it wasn't dated or signed, but it was there, unsent, just waiting. The content triggered a formal review of Ian's will. His solicitor confirmed the document hadn't been updated in 8 years. Christine was listed as primary beneficiary. Emily, the daughter, had been removed years prior after a falling out, the details of which were never documented officially. But the handwritten note raised a possibility. Ian may have been reconsidering. If he had planned to change the will, someone else might have known. That's when detectives asked, had there been any scheduled legal appointments in the days ahead? The answer was yes. Ian was due to meet with his solicitor that Friday, just 3 days after his death. The appointment was booked 10 days prior, Christine wasn't aware of it. The purpose was listed as property and estate revision. Whatever changes Ian had in mind, he never lived long enough to make them official. Inside the barn, examiners revisited the scene under ultraviolet light. On a beam above the blood trail, they discovered a partial fingerprint, smeared but usable. It matched Christine's right index finger. Positioning analysis indicated she had either steadied herself or leaned on the beam during or after the incident. Next to that beam was a shelf, and on that shelf was a spray bottle labeled Hoof Shine. Inside, forensic chemists detected a trace solution of bleach diluted in warm water, unusual for that particular product. The bottle itself tested positive for trace elements of human blood. The presence of bleach didn't match Christine's earlier claim that nothing had been cleaned. She told investigators she hadn't touched anything after Ian collapsed, that she was in shock, that she froze. But the lab results didn't freeze. They kept moving forward. Detective Wallace quietly ordered a timeline reconstruction. Not just what happened, but when it likely occurred, and how long it took. Surveillance canvassing from nearby properties revealed little, but one farm gate camera across the road caught something subtle. Christine moving back and forth across the yard, twice, between 6:50 and 7:06 a.m. Once near the stables, once near the feed bins. Neither pass involved calling for help. By the time 911 was dialed, Ian had already been down for at least 10 minutes. Wallace scribbled one note in the margin of his case log. Silence can be an action. Detectives circled back to motive, even though they weren't ready to name one publicly. Financial strain didn't appear to be a factor. The couple had no significant debt. There was no life insurance policy. There were minor disputes about selling a portion of the land. Nothing criminal or hostile. The most credible trigger, investigators now believed, was control, legal, domestic, emotional. Control that may have slipped. In the days ahead, that question, who controlled what and when, would shape everything that followed. If you want to know how a crime builds, look at what people tolerated before it exploded. In Bronton, no one expected anything violent from the Rawls, not because they seemed loving, but because they seemed exhausted. Quiet, stiff, and withdrawn in public. They were the couple who arrived separately to the village market and barely acknowledged each other. But they were predictable. Predictable is comfortable, until it breaks. Detectives began their fourth day on the case with a shift in focus. The forensic evidence had narrowed the window of death. The digital timeline already raised concerns. Now it was time to look backward. If Christine claimed Ian had been emotionally abusive for decades, and if Ian's final messages implied he no longer trusted his wife, there had to be some kind of history. They started by pulling the call logs. Between 1999 and 2022, Devon Cornwall police received 14 calls from the Rawl residents. All classified under non-criminal disturbances, verbal disputes, welfare concerns. Not one resulted in charges, arrests, or protective orders. Reviewing those records revealed a troubling pattern. In half the calls, Christine reported Ian as threatening or verbally abusive. In the other half, Ian claimed Christine had tampered with his food, locked him out, or deliberately provoked him. No officer ever saw bruises. No medical follow-ups were ordered. Notes from one 2017 call described the couple as hostile but cooperative and unlikely to escalate. It's the kind of report you write when you're trying to close the file. One officer noted in a 2020 visit that Ian seemed irritable and controlling, but added that Christine showed no visible fear. In retrospect, that line raised more questions than it answered. Investigators next turned to civilian witnesses, people close enough to see but maybe not close enough to intervene. That meant neighbors. Over a dozen homes bordered the Rawls' property line. 6 neighbors agreed to be interviewed. The statements followed a common thread. Loud arguments in the early evening. Shouting, doors slamming, nothing ever physical, at least not observed. One neighbor recalled hearing Christine yelling once in 2019, "You always ruin everything." Another said Ian had complained of someone spying on him through the curtains, but no one ever called the police themselves. One neighbor's security camera was checked for potential footage. Nothing from the day of the crime, but one recording from April 2022 showed a brief shouting match by the barn entrance. No physical contact, just words. The audio was unusable, and the footage wasn't probative. Still, it painted a fuller picture. These weren't isolated outbursts. This was a baseline of their life. Christine's own equine therapy clients were also contacted. One woman described Christine as focused, intuitive, and meticulous. Another said she never talked about her personal life, but occasionally made passive comments like, "I'm used to chaos." It wasn't enough to build a psychological profile, but it was enough to suggest she didn't operate without structure. As the investigation broadened, detectives found no history of mental illness documented for either party, no antidepressants, no mood stabilizers. Ian had minor prescriptions for arthritis and blood pressure. Christine's records listed hormone replacement therapy and nothing else. A review of veterinary appointments at the farm added an unexpected clue. In July 2022, just 4 weeks before Ian's death, a vet had been called to sedate a horse described as aggressive and unpredictable. The notes indicated Christine insisted on being alone during the sedation process, which required preparing a syringe of xylazine. No record showed how that medication was disposed of after use. And there was no forensic evidence that xylazine had been administered to Ian, but its presence on the property triggered follow-up testing of the coffee mugs found in the kitchen. Toxicology labs found no sedatives in Ian's bloodstream. But 2 of the mugs, still drying on the rack, showed trace residue of caffeine and a secondary compound, detected but not conclusively identified. Investigators requested advanced mass spectrometry. It would take time. Meanwhile, Detective Wallace revisited the control hypothesis. If Christine had grown tired of being managed, or simply wanted to take back ownership of the land, the timing made sense. Ian had booked his solicitor to revise the will. He had reconnected with his daughter. He was, in a sense, closing the loop without Christine. Sometimes, Wallace noted, people don't kill because they lose control. They kill because they're about to. But proving intent would require more than speculation. It needed motive paired with action. The next step was to revisit Christine's own narrative and compare it not to what she said, but to what she left out. Some suspects speak too much, others say too little. The ones who worry investigators most are the ones who never flinch, who seem convinced their version of events will hold, no matter how far it bends from the evidence. Christine Rahl wasn't rattled. That was the first thing detectives noticed when they sat across from her in interview room 2 at the Barnstable police station. The interview began exactly 4 days after Ian Rahl's death, under caution and recorded in full. Christine waived her right to legal counsel. She didn't ask for a break. She answered all questions. But what stood out most wasn't what she said. It was how little her story moved. She claimed the morning began as usual. Ian got up before her, made coffee, fed the dog. Around 6:30 a.m., she said she heard him outside working in the barn. At 6:45, she walked out to bring him a pair of gloves and found him already collapsed near the stables. She couldn't recall hearing a fall, couldn't recall a sound. When asked why she waited until 7:07 to call 911, she said she panicked and didn't know what to do. That version had several known issues. First, forensic sequencing showed Ian was upright after the stabbing, moved more than 20 meters, and left a trail indicating an attempt to reach help. Second, her phone log showed an outgoing call to her friend before emergency services were contacted. And third, she had cleaned part of the area, fed the animals, and secured the dogs. All that happened before she called for help. When presented with these facts, Christine didn't dispute them. She simply said she did what came naturally. That phrase, what came naturally, was noted by both investigators in the room. Because for most people, checking a pulse, shouting for help, or calling 911 would come first. Feeding animals and wiping down counters would not. As the interview continued, detectives introduced new forensic details. The glove with Ian's blood. The knife sharpened recently, the partial fingerprint on the beam, the mislabeled spray bottle with diluted bleach. Each time, Christine acknowledged the items as hers. Each time, she denied any knowledge of how they ended up where they were found. She never changed her tone, never became defensive, just still. There was a moment, though, brief but telling, when detectives brought up the solicitor appointment. Ian had scheduled a meeting to update his will, and Christine admitted she didn't know about it. Her reaction wasn't anger or disbelief. It was silence. She blinked, looked away for a second, and asked how they knew. That detail wasn't in any of the public documentation, which meant she was either surprised or she already suspected. And that subtle shift gave the interviewers something they hadn't had up to that point, a misalignment, a moment where control slipped, even briefly. Outside the interview room, the case team reviewed Christine's full digital behavior. Her phone usage before and after Ian's death was remarkably consistent with her habits over the past 6 months. No deleted texts, no missing apps, no sudden data purges. But within the Notes app, investigators found something else. A single entry, dated July 28, 2022, 3 weeks before Ian's death. The note read, "Finish what you start, no more waiting." It wasn't incriminating by itself. It could have been about anything. A reminder, a motivational quote. But context, once again, mattered. The entry appeared 3 days after a heated argument neighbors reported hearing, and 2 days before Christine ordered a new sharpening stone for the kitchen knives. Detectives documented the pattern but held the note back, for now. A psychological assessment was quietly initiated, not to diagnose her but to prepare for trial. The working theory. Christine wasn't impulsive. She didn't lash out. She executed a decision based on a personal threshold no one else could see, and that made things harder to prove in court. Intent requires more than action. It requires foresight. Investigators needed to show that Christine anticipated Ian's death, not just reacted to it. That's why the case would lean heavily on sequencing, on gaps in judgment, on what she didn't do when a reasonable person would have. That standard, what a reasonable person would do, was now the centerpiece of the Crown's theory, and by that measure, Christine's behavior failed. As Detective Wallace noted in his case log that afternoon, there was no urgency, no call for help, just a series of tasks completed like any other day. If there was shock, it was procedural. If there was fear, it never interfered with order. If there's one moment when an investigation becomes irreversible, it's the handoff from detectives to prosecutors. That's the point where facts stop circling and begin forming weight that can hold in court, weight that can convict. 3 weeks after Ian Rawls' death, the Crown Prosecution Service received the full case briefing. By then, the forensic path was solid. The wound trajectory, the single point of entry, the lack of defensive injuries, it all aligned. The timeline had been verified and re-verified. Ian collapsed no later than 7:02 a.m. Christine waited until 7:07 a.m. to call for help. Between those 5 minutes stood a trail of actions that didn't fit any definition of panic. But the CPS didn't need drama. They needed structure, a clear chain of cause and response. Investigators provided exactly that. First, the physical sequence. A sharpened household knife, consistent with the Rawls kitchen set, was found hidden near the stables. Ian's blood on the blade, a partial fingerprint on a support beam near the blood pool, confirmed to be Christine's. Trace diluted bleach inside a hoofshine bottle found less than 6 feet from the barn door. Swabs from that bottle revealed residual human blood matching Ian's profile. Christine admitted to owning the knife, using the barn daily, and cleaning animal equipment with bleach, but denied placing the bottle near the scene. Then came the digital trail. Christine's phone recorded a call to her friend at 6:48 a.m. prior to any emergency services call. That friend arrived on the property to care for animals while Ian lay dying on the gravel. Christine's 911 call was placed only after all animals were accounted for. That order of priority mattered. Next was the behavioral data. Surveillance footage from a neighboring property showed Christine walking from the stable to the yard twice between 6:50 and 7:06. The movement appeared controlled, not rushed. No attempt to flag down help, no signs of distress, just back and forth movement, routine, measured, but evidence doesn't convict on its own. It needs narrative. That's where intent came in. CPS prosecutors highlighted the following elements. Ian had booked a solicitor appointment to revise his will, scheduled for 3 days after his death. Christine had no knowledge of it. A draft email was found on Ian's tablet, stating he wanted his daughter Emily to inherit the property, specifically noting he didn't trust Christine. Christine had searched online for stab wound collapsed lung and death from one stab 2 weeks prior. A handwritten note found in Christine's desk, dated July 28th, read, "Finish what you start, no more waiting." None of these points proved premeditation in isolation, but together they established a pattern of increasing tension, preparation, and opportunity. Psychological evaluation results were summarized for prosecutorial use, not to claim Christine was mentally ill, but to present her as methodical and highly controlled. No history of impulsivity, no documented trauma response, no clinical explanation for the absence of shock or instinctive emergency behavior. The CPS prepared an indictment under Section 1 of the Homicide Act 1957, murder with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. The decision to pursue murder over manslaughter came down to behavior after the act. Christine didn't assist Ian. She didn't seek help immediately. She organized her surroundings before alerting anyone. That, combined with the physical evidence, gave prosecutors what they needed. A final piece added weight. Interviews with two of Christine's longtime friends. Both described her as composed, quiet, and private. But one recalled a statement made during a walk in May, just months before the incident. Christine had allegedly said, "One day I'll get my life back and I won't have to ask." The friend had dismissed it at the time. Now it was part of the file. The case wasn't just about a stabbing. It was about control, about timing, about a person who, under mounting pressure, made a decision and executed it with minimal disruption. That's what made it dangerous. Detective Wallace described it best during his final handover briefing. "If this had been chaos, we'd have had questions. But the absence of chaos is what convinced us, that and the order she chose to preserve. Courtroom narratives are rarely about who did it. They're about how clearly you can prove the person intended to. And in cases like this, quiet crime, no confession, single wound, intent has to be built from absence. Absence of reaction. Absence of urgency. Absence of anything that suggests the death wasn't anticipated." Christine Rawls' trial began in early March 2024 at Exeter Crown Court. The charge, murder with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. She pleaded not guilty, no defense of insanity, no self-defense claim, just a blanket denial of intent. Prosecution opened with a clear structure, motive, method, and control. They didn't rely on dramatic storytelling. Instead, they layered fact over behavior and behavior over opportunity. A precise wound, a controlled response, a delay in contacting help, a pattern of quiet conflict. The jury didn't need to hear Christine scream. They needed to see she never did. The coroner, Dr. Grace Monroe, was the first expert to testify. Her delivery was clinical. She described the depth and angle of the wound, the lack of defensive injuries, the signs of controlled bleeding internally. When asked how long Ian could have remained conscious, she said, "Long enough to crawl, but not long enough to survive without intervention." That set the tone. The forensic team followed. The pathologist who confirmed blood drops consistent with standing injury. The trace analyst who matched the diluted bleach to human blood in a mislabeled cleaning bottle. The fingerprint technician who found Christine's print on the beam above Ian's body. All reinforced the same theme: controlled environment, cleaned space, and a deliberate effort not to disturb the scene further than necessary. Next came the digital forensic analyst. His role was to map the timeline. Christine's call to a friend at 6:48 a.m. was logged, as was the movement recorded on a neighbor's security system between 6:50 and 7:06. She moved deliberately, never checked the lane, never tried to wave down a vehicle. And when the 911 call finally came at 7:07, her tone was flat, her instructions brief. That detail mattered. Jurors aren't trained to interpret silence, but they understand order. And Christine's mourning followed a specific one. The defense began their case by establishing context. They described a long marriage marked by imbalance, Christine being emotionally cornered, financially manipulated, psychologically undermined. They called her a victim of coercive control, presenting a relationship that had eroded for years beneath the surface. It wasn't a far-fetched angle. The police had received 14 calls to the property over 2 decades, some from Christine, some from Ian. But when asked why she didn't leave, Christine didn't give a clear answer. When asked why she didn't call for help immediately, she said she couldn't think straight. And when asked why she hid the knife, she denied knowing how it got there. That gap between plausible history and implausible action became the line prosecutors leaned on. They didn't have to prove Christine was cruel. They just had to prove she was clear-headed enough in that moment to make choices. The defense called a psychologist to support the theory of trauma-induced freeze response. The expert spoke about how years of psychological abuse can impair response mechanisms in high-stress situations. But the prosecution countered with Christine's behavior after the fact: coordinated phone calls, organized animal care, item concealment. A person frozen in shock does not feed horses and hide cleaning fluid. That point, made by the Crown's lead barrister, was repeated twice. Not for drama, for retention. One of the most consequential moments came when the jury was shown a printout of Christine's phone note from 3 weeks prior. Finish what you start, no more waiting. It was the only line of text in that note. Dated, time-stamped. She claimed it related to a personal horse therapy project, but no such record existed. And cross-examination made clear, she never mentioned the phrase to anyone, never used it again. Ian's daughter took the stand late in the week. Her testimony wasn't long. She recalled her father saying just days before he died that he was done being used, that he planned to fix the will before it's too late. There were no tears, just a plain, bitter sentence. He knew what was coming. I think he just thought he had more time. It wasn't evidence, but it stayed in the room. Jurors don't need every fact to be loud. They just need a structure that holds under weight. By the end of week 2, the prosecution rested with over 120 exhibits submitted. The defense had few factual disputes, only interpretation. Christine never changed her story, but in a case where the facts said more than she did, that wasn't necessarily to her advantage. In March 2024, Christine Rawl was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 18 years for the murder of her partner, James Hemming. The judge called it a deliberate cold act, emphasizing not just the fatal wound, but her refusal to help as he lay dying. The evidence was overwhelming, not because of drama, but because of her detachment. She waited hours before calling for help. In that time, Hemming's internal bleeding worsened, and he died alone. Forensic reports confirmed he could have survived with prompt medical attention. Digital records showed Christine texting her son about unrelated matters while James lay dying. During her 999 call, she spoke calmly, almost clinically. At no point did she express urgency or remorse. Investigators found no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds, only silence and a single, fatal stab wound. Christine's son, once vocal online in her defense, went silent. Hemming's daughter released a quiet but firm statement. He died believing the woman beside him would help. She didn't. The house remains empty, a property listing now replacing crime scene tape. This case isn't just about a murder. It's about the kind of violence that wears no visible face: neglect, silence, emotional control. Christine had training in human behavior. She understood vulnerability. And when it mattered most, she weaponized that knowledge. I've seen what silence can do. Not just the silence of a room, but the silence of people who look the other way, who dismiss red flags, who assume it's not that bad. This case reminded me that real danger doesn't always come with shouting or bruises. Sometimes it sits across the table, calm and calculated. So, if something feels off, trust your instinct. Speak up. Protect your peace. What do you think? Is inaction as dangerous as action? Have you ever seen someone ignore a warning sign until it was too late? If this story spoke to you, let me know where you're watching from or how it made you feel. And if it didn't land, tell me why. I welcome all views. If you found this video meaningful, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next case. Your support helps keep stories like this alive.